This is the true story of Frank Bettger, who at 29 was a total failure, yet 10 years later had achieved a measure of success that exceeded anything he had ever hoped for. Whether you were selling shoes or ships, sealing wax or insurance, you will find sales dynamite in the ideas and principles which led this man of ordinary ability from failure to success. Frank Bettger started out as a professional baseball player. He came up from the minor leagues to play third base for the St. Louis Cardinals. Then one day, the doctor told him his baseball days were over. He had picked up a swinging bunt while on a dead run and tried to throw the ball in the opposite direction. Something snapped in his arm. His baseball career was over. He decided to become a salesman. For almost a year, he tried to sell.
I'm sorry, I'm not interested.
Not interested.
Not interested. Not interested.
Not interested.
Not interested. Not interested. Not interested. Not interested.
I remember that day. That was the day I decided to quit. It was some years ago, but I remember just how I felt. I had spent 10 of the longest and most disheartening months of my whole life trying to sell. I didn't know any more about selling than a jackrabbit. I finally concluded that I was never cut out to be a salesman. I was broke. I was almost 30. I was a failure. I went back to the office a few days later to pick up some of my personal belongings. I expected to be there only a few minutes. There was nothing I wanted less than to sit through another sales meeting. The more they talked, the more discouraged I got. They were talking about things that I knew I couldn't possibly do. I stopped listening. Their voices sounded miles away. Then I heard the president, Mr. Talbot, utter one sentence that has had a profound and lasting effect on my life for the last 33 years.
Well, gentlemen, after all, this business of selling narrows down to one thing. Just one thing. Seeing the people. Now, you show me any man of ordinary ability who will go out and earnestly tell his story to 4 or 5 people every day, and I will show you a man who just can't help making good.
Well, that almost lifted me right out of my chair. I'd believe anything that Mr. Talbot said. Here was a man who started working for the company when he was 11 years old, worked his way through every department. He actually was out selling on the street for several years. He knew what he was talking about. It was just as though the sun had suddenly burst out of the clouds. I made up my mind right then to take him at his word. But I was happy. What a great relief came over me, for I knew I was going to make good. Seeing more people did increase my sales. I sold more in the next 10 weeks than I had in the previous 10 months. Even that wasn't much, but it proved to me that Mr. Talbot knew what he was talking about. I could sell. I soon discovered, however, that to continue to make these calls, I had to organize my time more effectively. So I began to plan an entire week ahead. I kept records on every call. I never could find words to express the courage and faith those records gave me. But they also showed that I didn't know how to close a sale. About this time, when I was groping around in the dark, desperately trying to learn how to sell, I picked up a book that had a tremendous effect on my life, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin told how he discovered an idea while he was just a small printer in Philadelphia and badly in debt. Franklin made a list of 13 subjects which he felt were necessary or desirable for him to acquire and try to master. He then took one subject at a time and devoted a week's strict attention to that one thing, leaving all the others to their ordinary chance. In this way, he was able to go through his entire list in 13 weeks and repeat the whole process 4 times a year. Franklin said he owed all his success and happiness in life to this one idea, and he hoped his descendants would use it and reap the benefits. It was like a legacy to me. I followed the plan just as Franklin gave it, except that I substituted several subjects which I thought would be more helpful to me in my work. I had each subject typed on a separate 3x5 card with a brief summary. I called the cards pocket reminders. I had a special reason for my first subject. It was a lesson I had to learn twice. I was called on one night in one of Dale Carnegie's public speaking classes, which I had joined with the hope of destroying the biggest enemy I ever had to face, fear. I was mumbling along with my speech when I heard Mr. Carnegie say,
Mr. Bettger, just a moment. Just a moment, please. Are you interested in what you're saying?
Yes, of course.
Well, then why don't you show a little enthusiasm? How do you expect your audience to be interested in you if you don't put life and animation into what you say?
Mr. Carnegie then gave a stirring talk on the power of enthusiasm. He got so excited, he threw a chair against the wall and broke off one of its legs. My thoughts went back to my baseball days. It was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. I was young, ambitious, wanted to get to the top. And what happened? I was fired. My whole life might have been different if I hadn't gone to the manager and asked him why he fired me.
Bert.
Why'd you fire me?
Frank, I fired you because you're lazy.
Lazy? That's the last thing I expected to hear you say.
You drag yourself around a field like a veteran who's been playing ball for 20 years. Why do you act that way if you're not lazy?
I don't know. Get so darn scared and nervous out there sometimes, I feel like I want to hide my face from the crowd. Well, I guess if I sort of take it easy for a while, I'll be able to get over my nervousness.
Frank, it'll never work. Sit down. That's one of the things that's been holding you down. Wherever you go when you leave here, for heaven's sake, wake up and put some life and enthusiasm into your work.
A week later, New Haven, Connecticut agreed to give me a trial. So I made a resolution that I would show them the most enthusiastic ball player they had ever seen. From the minute I appeared on the field, I acted like a man electrified. The thermometer that day was nearly 100, but I never felt better in my life as I ran around that field. Did it work? It worked like magic. Imagine the thrill of reading the newspaper account of that game and having it say about me, this new player, Bettger, has a barrel of enthusiasm. He inspired our boys. They not only won the game, but they looked better than at any time this season. The newspapers began calling me Pep Bettger. Why wouldn't enthusiasm do the same thing for me in selling? My next prospect was going to see the most enthusiastic salesman he ever saw in his life. I overdid it, of course. I expected every minute to have this man stop me and ask if there was anything wrong with me. But he never did, except to ask questions. Did he throw me out? No, he bought. And from that day on, I began to sell. The magic of enthusiasm began to work for me in business, just as it had in baseball. But I soon found that in order to maintain that enthusiasm, there were other principles I had to learn. One warm August morning, I managed to get an interview with a large wholesale grocer named John Scott. In about 30 seconds, Mr. Scott gave me all the reasons why he wouldn't buy.
You're wasting your time and mine. I'm 63 years old. I don't have to worry about my family. If anything happened to me, he'd have no money that is good for them.
Mr. Scott, surely a man who's been as successful as you have must have some other interests besides your family and your business? Some hospital or religious work? Perhaps missionaries or charitable work of some worthy purpose? Did you ever consider that if anything should happen to you, your support would be withdrawn? Wouldn't that loss handicap some splendid work or mean that it might even be entirely discontinued?
2 hours later, I walked out of Mr. Scott's office with a check for $8,672 to put the plan into action. I was floating on air. Since that sale was made by a green blundering dub like me who had never finished grade school, it created a mild sensation, and I was invited to tell about it at a national sales convention in Boston. Was that a proud moment?
Mr. Scott almost convinced me that he didn't need insurance. I found out that Mr. Scott supported 3 foreign missions, and that these missions were very dear to his heart. I asked many questions about those missions. Every time Mr. Scott started talking about my proposition costing too much money, I asked more questions and expressed more interest in the missions and the wonderful work they were doing. Finally, he bought.
Following my talk, I was stopped in the lobby and congratulated by Clayton M. Hunsaker, a nationally known salesman. Mr. Hunsaker then uttered the most vital truth I have ever heard about selling and dealing with people in business.
Congratulations, Mr. Bettger.
Well, thank you, sir.
I still doubt whether you know exactly why you were able to make that sale.
What do you mean by that?
The most important secret of salesmanship is to find out what the other fellow wants. Then help him find the best way to get it. You didn't sell that man Scott insurance. Do you realize that? You sold him a way to keep those missions going. That's what he bought, and that's why he bought. In the first minute of your interview with Scott, you took a blind stab and accidentally found out what he wanted. Then you showed him how he could get it. You kept talking more about it, asking more questions about it, never letting him get away from the one thing he wanted. If you will always remember this one rule, then no matter what you're selling, selling will be easy.
Clayton Hunsaker was right. I began to understand now why I had been meeting with such terrific opposition in most of my interviews. I realized that I had just been barging in, talking for a sale, without knowing or even trying to find out anything about the other fellow's situation. Before this, I had largely thought of selling as just another way of making a living for myself. But now, I was inspired. I resolved right then to dedicate the rest of my selling career to this principle, finding out what people want and help them get it. Here was something more than a sales technique. It was a philosophy to live by. When I returned home from that convention in Boston, I eagerly substituted a new card in my list of 13 principles. Clayton Hunsaker's philosophy I put down as think in terms of others. I was to make one more major change in my list, substituting a card entitled Questions. I was attending a large sales congress at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. One of America's top salesmen, J. Elliott Hall, was speaking. He said that he originally failed as a salesman because he made too many positive statements. That sounded silly to me. But then Elliott Hall electrified that large audience by throwing it open to objections and answers. The excitement became terrific as Elliott Hall gave a super demonstration of how he met these objections. Not with smart stock answers. He met these objections by asking questions. He didn't attempt to tell people he was smarter than they. And prove to them that they were wrong. He simply asked questions until the answers added up to one conclusion, a sound conclusion based on facts. Following Benjamin Franklin's plan and applying these principles made me literally a different man. Although I fell far short of mastering any of these principles, I found this simple plan a truly magic formula. Without it, I doubt whether I could have maintained my enthusiasm. And I believe if a man can maintain enthusiasm long enough, it will accomplish anything. Now, let me give you, right off the bat, the 13 points, the track I ran on. Enthusiasm. Order, self-organization. Think in terms of others' interests. Questions. Key issue. Silence. Listen. Sincerity. Deserve confidence. Knowledge of my business. Appreciation and praise. Smile. Happiness. Remember names and faces. Service and prospecting. Closing the sale. Action. I was in my office one day. The telephone rang. It was a friend of mine in New York calling. A manufacturer in that city was borrowing a large amount of money. The people lending the money insisted on an equal amount of insurance on the life of the president as security for the loan. About 10 of the largest companies had already submitted elaborate proposals. Would I be interested in submitting a proposition? I said yes, if an appointment could be made. The appointment was made for 10:45 the next morning. After that phone call, I sat at my desk for about 30 minutes, thinking, what should I say to this man? Nothing I could think of appealed to me. Elliot Hall had made a big point of asking questions to find the key issue. What is the key issue here? Credit. He doesn't want insurance any more than Mr. Scott did. What he really wants is credit.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Frank Bettger. I have an appointment with Mr. Booth this morning at 10:45.
Oh, yes, Mr. Bettger. Won't you sit down, please?
Thank you. While waiting to see Mr. Booth that morning, I had a lot of confidence because I had studied my questions, 14 of them, over and over. To strengthen my confidence, I decided to take a long chance and had made an appointment for 11:30 a.m. with Dr. Carlisle, a big New York medical examiner, an appointment I'd need only if I made the sale.
All right, Mr. Bettger, you may go in.
Thank you. Mr. Booth.
How do you do, Mr. Bettger? Have a seat.
Mr. Booth waited for me to talk, but I waited for him.
Mr. Bettger, you're just wasting your time.
Why?
I have plans submitted here by 10 of the leading companies. One of these was presented by a close personal friend of mine. He plays golf with me every weekend. He's with the New York Life. That's a pretty good company, isn't it?
None better in the world.
Well, Mr. Bettger, if you want to submit a proposition, why not just make up the figures and send it in to me? I'll consider it along with the other proposals sometime in the next few weeks, and if your plan's the cheapest and best, you'll get the business. But I think you're just wasting your time and my time.
Mr. Booth, If you were my own brother, I would say to you what I'm going to say to you now.
What's that?
Knowing what I do about the insurance business, if you were my own brother, I'd tell you to take all those proposals and immediately throw them in that waste paper basket.
Why do you say that?
Dynamite had been exploded, and I was prepared to back it up with facts. I explained that the companies bidding for the business were among the best in the world. Over the years, one proposal was just as likely to be the lowest cost proposition as another. Then I swung right into my questions. Those questions began to bring out the real key issue, which was not net cost at all, but the risk he was taking of losing this vital credit by delay. Now, Mr. Booth, my job is to help you arrive at a final decision. In order to help you do this, I must ask you some questions. Is that all right?
Sure, go right ahead.
As I understand, your company's to be extended a running line of credit of $250,000. Part of the deal is that your life is to be insured for $250,000, the policies assigned to your creditors. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
In other words, they have confidence in you if you live. But in the event of your death, they don't have the same confidence in your company. Isn't that right, Mr. Booth?
Yes, I suppose that is true.
Then why isn't it of paramount importance, in fact, the only thing of importance, that you obtain this insurance immediately and transfer that risk to the insurance companies? Suppose you should wake up tonight, in the middle of the night, and it should suddenly occur to you that the fire insurance on that big plant of yours up in Connecticut had expired yesterday. Why, you probably wouldn't be able to get back to sleep the rest of the night, and the first thing tomorrow morning, you'd have your broker on the phone asking him to protect you immediately, wouldn't you?
Yes, I suppose I would.
Well, these creditors regard the insurance on your life with just the same importance that you regard the fire insurance on that property of yours. Now, isn't it possible, if anything developed, whereby you were unable to obtain this insurance on your life, that your creditors might postpone or even entirely refuse to grant this loan to you?
Oh, I don't know. Of course, that's a possibility.
And if you should find yourself unable to obtain this credit, wouldn't it probably mean thousands and thousands of dollars to you? Wouldn't it probably mean the difference between a profit and a loss to your business this year?
Yes, I suppose that is true.
My questions kept hammering this point home. I announced that I had an appointment at 11:30 that very morning with Dr. Carlisle, the only examiner whose single examination was good for the large amount involved. Any other procedure would involve at least 2 doctors and several days of delay at best. Well, then why should you take that risk for another week or even another day?
Oh, I think I'm going to live for a while.
Suppose you should wake up tomorrow morning with a sore throat, and you were laid up for a week with a grip. And then when you felt well enough to take this difficult examination, the doctors would say to you, well, now, Mr. Booth, we think you're going to be all right again, but there's some condition that's probably the result of this recent illness, and we must postpone action for 3 or 4 months. Then you'd have to tell your creditors that the final judgment has been postponed. Isn't it possible that they would postpone the extension of this loan to you? Isn't that a possibility?
Yes, of course, that's a possibility.
Mr. Booth, it is now 11:10. If we leave here immediately, we can go down to Dr. Carlisle's office and keep that appointment with him at 11:30. You look as though you never felt better in your life. If you're as good on the inside as you look on the outside, we should be able to have this insurance in effect within 48 hours. You are feeling well this morning, aren't you, Mr. Booth?
Yes, I'm feeling very well.
Well, then why isn't this examination the most important thing in the world you could possibly do right now?
Mr. Bettger, whom do you represent?
I represent you. Then followed a long, awkward silence that seemed like eternity. I had to bite my tongue to keep myself from talking while Mr. Booth was thinking.
Let's go. Miss Moffat,
I'll be back probably about 2:30.
Mr. Booth was sold and seemed to suddenly become my friend. He insisted on taking me to lunch with him.
You know, some of my friends who've been bidding for this business are going to get a big shock.
But they've been pushing me around for weeks, knocking each other, each one trying to show me that his price was the lowest. You didn't knock anybody, but you made me realize the risk I was taking by waiting. In fact, as you kept asking me those questions, I became terrified, thinking of the possibility of losing that credit.
If I were your own brother, I would say to you what I'm going to say to you now. You haven't got much more time. I don't know how old you are, but let's assume, for example, you're about 35. It's later than you think. It won't be long before you'll be 40. And once you pass 40, time goes so fast. I know. I am now 63 years old, and I just can't believe it. It makes my head swim when I think how fast time has gone since I was 40. Now that you've seen this film, I think I know how you must feel. Exactly as I would if I were seeing it for the first time. You may be confused. You don't know what to do about it. Well, there's one of three things you can do about it. First, nothing. If you do nothing about it, seeing this film has probably been a total waste of your time. Second, you can say, well, there are a lot of good ideas here. I'm going to take all of them and do the very best I can about it. If you do that, I prophesy failure. Third, you can take the advice of one of the greatest minds this country ever produced, Benjamin Franklin. I know exactly what he would say if it were possible for you to sit down alongside of him today and ask his advice. He tells us right in his autobiography. He would tell you to take one thing at a time and devote a week's strict attention to that one thing, leaving all the others to their ordinary chance. Let's assume that you select 13 subjects best suited to you. By concentrating on one at a time, you'll get farther with it in 1 week than you otherwise would in a year. A new confidence will take hold of you. At the end of 13 weeks, you'll be surprised with the progress you will make. If your friends, business associates, and your family fail to tell you that they have noticed a big change come over you, then I know by the time you repeat the second 13 weeks, everybody will see in you a greatly different person.